Good afternoon, it's Monday the 29th of January 2018, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio, of course, Mike Robinson, and we are delighted to also be joined today by Alex Thomson with Eastern Approaches. Mike, I had to start on this as a very emotive issue, but it was Theresa May boasting that she'd been signing the Holocaust book. This is the famous page with her signature. She had this to say: "The pages of this book unite us in a commitment to remember all those who suffered during the Holocaust. We stand together to honour the lives lost and those who survive. As Prime Minister, I pledge to do everything in my power to ensure we can never forget where prejudice and hatred can lead. The new National Memorial to the Holocaust will sit in the shadow of Parliament alongside a world-class learning centre to do just that. It will make a permanent statement of our promise to remember and clear commitment to teach future generations to fight hatred in all its forms. By supporting the Holocaust Educational Trust and all its partners, we will safeguard the memory of survivors and learn lessons for generations to come." So those were her fine words with regard to the Holocaust. But this is the same Prime Minister who was responsible as Home Secretary, and her responsibility continues with as Prime Minister, with incarcerating child abuse survivors in prison without medical treatment, in solitary confinement for periods of over 19 months with no idea of the sentence and no idea of any release date. I believe that this is just appalling hypocrisy, Mike, and I do not believe that Theresa May should be allowed to get away with this type of duplicity in her political life. We'll leave the rest up to our viewers and listeners. Are the Russians coming?
I don't think so.
Okay, so today we probably will tell rather than run and hide.
I'm certainly not going to be hiding.
Okay.
Right, well, Russiagate continues to rumble on. Now this is Senator Chuck Grassley, and he and Lindsey Graham on Thursday sent a letter to John Podesta, Joel Benenson, who was with the Obama campaign and was chief strategist for Hillary Clinton, that is, also Chairwoman Donna Brazile and Debbie Wasserman Schultz, the current DNC chairman Tom Perez as well. The letter asked 12 questions, and we have some of the questions here. So, for example, prior to the Washington Post article in October of 2017, were you or anyone else at Hillary for America, Hillary Clinton's campaign, aware of Mr. Steele's, this Christopher Steele, the MI6, ex-MI6 agent who wrote the dodgy dossier? Were you aware of Mr. Steele's efforts on behalf of the Clinton campaign to compile and distribute allegations about Mr. Trump and the Russian government? Did you or anyone else at Hillary for America receive copies of any memoranda comprising Mr. Steele's dossier prior to its publication by BuzzFeed in January of 2017? Did you or anyone else at Hillary for America receive other memoranda written or forwarded by Mr. Steele regarding Mr. Trump and his associates that were not published as part of the BuzzFeed dossier? Went on to ask, did you or anyone else at Hillary for America distribute outside of the organization any of the dossier memoranda, information contained therein, or other information obtained by Mr. Steele? Were you or anyone else at Hillary for America aware of Mr. Steele's contacts with the FBI or other government agencies prior to the 2016 election? And they also asked for all communications to or from a group of 40 named individuals, including John Brennan, Andrew McCabe, Peter Strzok, Bruce Orr, Fusion GPS in general, James Baker, and also Secretary of State, former Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland. So it is a rogues gallery of people involved in this, either directly being asked these questions or that some of the questions are being asked about. So maybe I could bring Alex Thomson in at this point, Alex, and say welcome to the program first of all. And this issue seems to refuse to die, but nobody's providing any evidence against Trump, and the evidence against the people that are pulling the so-called dodgy dossier together seems to be building.
It's the dossier that just will not die, isn't it, Mike? And, I never thought I would couple the name of a former SIS or MI6 officer with BuzzFeed, let alone a BuzzFeed dossier. The BuzzFeed famously was something that David Cameron, during the early part of his premiership, had to ask his staff what it was, and he famously used the article wrongly and said, "What is the BuzzFeed?" Because he was unaware of this political pressure building through new social media-driven, low-quality, shareable content that taps into memes. And then for this supposedly reputable news site to get hold of or commission or in some way associate itself with a dossier with former intelligence officers, everything about this process is knockoff. It's a knockoff news agency getting a knockoff spy to produce a knockoff report. And yet it just will not die. And there's so many such sites, some fervent Democrat sites, some not, some more partisan and some less so, some American and some European, that seem only to exist to push a complete narrative of the US president can do nothing right. They don't seem to be very interested in evidence or argument.
Absolutely.
That is the phrase, not interested in evidence or argument. We might come on to that particular analysis with regard to child abuse a little later in the news. Are the Americans prepared for the Russians coming? I've got to say, and I'll pass this back to Alex as well, it doesn't appear so. We've got this article from Navy Times. It says that the US Navy is declining to make public the number and nature of disciplinary actions taken against crew members. Now, this is against the background that the American Pacific Fleet has had, I think it's five major collisions. It's had a number of sailors die. And we've got senior retired American admirals now starting to question what is happening to the training of the American military. And I think at least some of those men and women are pointing fingers at what they call the new diversity-based training. They're effectively saying, I think, that the US Navy is placing more emphasis on diversity training and selection than it is on the ability to carry out combat operations. Is that unfair analysis, Alex? There's something very strange going on in the US Navy at the moment, the Pacific Fleet certainly.
Well, that there is something untoward going on in the US Pacific Fleet is beyond question, and that's agreed upon by all analysts, American, Russian, European, Chinese, whatever. One has to look also at the Chinese, German and French analyses as the other major navies. And not just the US and Russian ones. They all agree that the Pacific Fleet is not performing as it should do. There's been a replacement of the head of the Surface Navy, who's concentrated almost all his energies on this Pacific Fleet series of actions. The problem here is that the Pacific Fleet has, or rather the US Navy as a whole, has got a permission which other services don't have. And this permission is that it is allowed to stop some sailors from going to open court-martial, where they would be able to give arguments and to be represented properly and have the public there in some semblance of a common law trial. Uniquely, the US Navy doesn't have that. It claims it has a legal phrase called vessel exemption. And under this vessel exemption, the sailors can be sent to a secret process called a non-judicial punishment, or NJP. And if they're sent to a non-judicial punishment, you'll never hear what happened to those sailors or officers. The commanders themselves will be court-martialed publicly if it comes to that, the Fitzgerald and the others. But the sailors under them, the ratings, may actually find themselves out on their ear from the Navy with no job prospects and assumed by other people to have been dishonorably discharged because the US Navy wants to cover up some untoward things going on. And some analysts are saying that this is a result of there being different, quote, tribes in the US Navy, or within the Surface Fleet and the Pacific Fleet in particular. One tribe is interested in actually fighting wars in every vessel, and the other tribe, the implication is more interested in pursuing social doctrine and revolutionary diversity agendas, much as happened in the US Air Force, and I think in the Air Wing of the US Navy some years before. It's now got to the Surface Fleet. Of course, if it reaches the submarine fleet or the Army, then the whole US armed services are scuppered. They're not fighting fit.
This is a very dangerous precedent, Alex, and what it brings to my mind, of course, is the underwater collision between a British ballistic nuclear submarine and the French ballistic nuclear submarine Le Triomphant, where the public was given virtually no information, was So we don't know whether that was down to training or whatever. But if we've got training impacting on the ability to sail a warship safely in peacetime conditions, the chances of that ship being able to operate in wartime conditions, I would say, virtually zero. So this is very dangerous stuff, and we are focusing on training. And it seems to me interesting that this focus on problems in training, we can start to say same thing seems to be happening in the police, same thing seems to be happening in the National Health Service. Something is operating amongst normal training systems. Without taking too much time, I don't know whether you'd like to respond to that.
I think that people are not right in their head. They're not doing things that, even if you say that there were some quite bizarre electronic countermeasures at play, electronic warfare, even if you say their minds were addled by that or their equipment was scrambled, they weren't keeping basic watch in the nighttime conditions. They were preoccupied with their training, or possibly with each other in various untoward ways. Sex and violence may come into it with the number of tribes that there are on these warships now. And I think you've invented or coined a one-word phrase to describe this, which is that they've been reframed. I think we need to look very, very hard at the training which the US military is getting, or this part of it, along the lines that you've done in the past with British police and healthcare staff.
Alex, I have to just add to that, and then we'll move on, that of course one of the phrases that's being used in training everywhere now is disruptors. So the British government has been boasting through the Behavioural Insights team and the Cabinet Office as two sources that in order to transform training of many organisations, we need people to disrupt it. Of course, if you disrupt important organisations in how they work, how they operate, you are going to get mistakes, errors, and people are going to die. We'll come on to this in more detail another time, but thank you for that analysis.
Right, let's move on to Brexit. Now, last week there was quite a bit of stuff in the press about the fact that the European Union withdrawal bill had moved to the House of Lords, and quite a number of comments from particularly Brexit supporters saying, well, the House of Lords is a dodgy institution. It's got lots of pro-Remain people within it, and the House of Lords better not prevent the United Kingdom leaving the European Union by scuppering this bill. And if there's 2 points to make here. The first point, of course, is that this bill has got very, very little to do with actually leaving the European Union. If anything, it's about how we stay within its infrastructure and its institutions. Because, of course, one of the main thing that this bill does is to bring the body of European Union law onto the British statute books in some form or another. Now, this is the Constitution Committee of the House of Lords that have issued a report today, and it's saying that the withdrawal bill, as it currently stands, needs to be substantially rewritten. It's saying it's probably, well, I'll say it's probably going to be an issue of debate, as I've sort of hinted at a few seconds ago, with the Remain supporting peers to vote for what they're describing as a motion of regret, that the UK will not have a second bite at a referendum to decide on the final thing. But nonetheless, this report saying that they're criticising the bill because the method proposed to create a new category. There's a method proposed to create a new category of, quotes, retained EU law that they believe would cause problematic uncertainties and ambiguities. This is from a constitutional point of view, because Britain does have a constitution. We've got to remember that. They said that the bill is dangerous in the sense that it is encouraging and providing ministers with the scope to amend regulations without parliamentary scrutiny. This is the so-called Henry VIII powers that have been widely covered recently. They're saying that it has an unacceptably wide emergency procedure for making short-term changes, and saying that the inability to secure agreements from Wales and Scotland could lead to, quote, significant constitutional repercussions. They say the bill is therefore fundamentally flawed from a constitutional perspective in multiple ways. They say we acknowledge the scale, challenge and unprecedented nature of the task converting existing EU law into UK law, but as it stands, the bill is constitutionally unacceptable. We will work with others around the Lords to change this bill so that it becomes an enabling measure for, rather than an obstacle to, a transitional period, as is currently the case. This will include seeking amendments relating to exit day, ensuring the government cannot reduce rights via secondary legislation, and providing greater clarity about the role of the European Court of Justice and the future status of case law. Labour has consistently called for a transition period based on current terms, including a temporary extension to our participation in the single market and customs union. This would prevent a cliff edge for consumers and businesses in March 2019. And this was the statement from the key person on the committee, Angela Smith, who of course is the Labour leader in the House of Lords. Now, Alex, I'm interested in your thoughts on this. Before we talk about the temporary extension, because we'll be talking about that in a second, my concern is here that a perception that the House of Lords is in some way going to take advantage of its Remainer majority to somehow scupper the process of Brexit. I think this is a trap that Brexit supporters are potentially going to fall into, because they're going to get on the constitutional reform. Let's dump the House of Lords bandwagon. This is a pretty dangerous situation, in my opinion, and I think this is partly being engineered. Any thoughts on that?
I think it's a real risk, Mike, and I think we need to take a step back and think what the House of Lords is. Perhaps even viewers in the United Kingdom are not fully aware of this. You cannot have an unchecked unicameral legislature. You can't have a single legislative body which sets statute law and then the Crown just rubber stamps it. It has to go through a deliberating chamber whose members act as senators, as they're called in some jurisdictions, or lords or peers of the realm, who are there to think from the point of view of the country, land, history, experience. Of course, there are flaws, but we're in a fallen world and we have to have these checks and balances. The Scottish Parliament, which is devolved, and the Senedd in Cardiff, and the Northern Ireland Assembly, which may be on its last legs, they're all unchecked unicameral legislatures. And what we were told in the devolution period of 2 decades ago is, don't worry, judicial review, so sending something to be looked at by a judge, judicial review will serve in lieu of deliberation in the second chamber. But of course, judges, single ones especially, are part of the same system. The whole point of a House of Lords is that it takes a different view, and that it's not accountable to anyone but its conscience and God. And of course, the oaths of allegiance to the Constitution. So there's a constitutional point. Look at the figures involved. One of the most prominent of the Lords in this process is Baroness Ros Altman, an American by birth, if I understand correctly, who gained notoriety during the Brexit campaign, referendum campaign period, by tweeting that we should obey our representatives, obey our members of Parliament. And now she's openly talking about it might be in Parliament's interests to extend the leaving period for 2 years, because that will be a better deal for us, unspecified interest groups. Although people may think she's speaking in the name of the country, but it's a bit of sleight of hand. So there are deeply deceptive people in the Lords and deeply compromised creatures of the system, but we cannot throw the baby out with the bathwater, because the last time we had an unchecked unicameral legislature was during the English Civil War, and look at how that turned out.
Well, that's absolutely right, Alex, and I'm not by any means suggesting that the Lords, as is currently constituted, is ideal, because it's far from it. But what is on offer, in fact, is a so-called elected upper chamber, and what we end up with, because we have a much stronger whipping system in the UK than, for example, the United States does, what we end up with potentially is the worst of all worlds, where we have a unicameral legislature which appears to be not.
The British are past masters at this, pretending that we do things just that bit more classily and more refined than other countries, with a touch of tradition. For example, we abolished the Law Lords, which was our Supreme Court, and we did so by creating a Supreme Court on paper where we'd never had such an institution. But during its creation, the Law Lords in question said, my lords, this is not going to be a Supreme Court because it doesn't have the powers. So we often do this in order to remove transparency from a system which had it without the name being there. We do so by creating independent and transparent institutions. It's a question of nomenclature, the labels you stick on things. Likewise, if you call the Lords something else like a reviewing chamber or a second chamber, or replace it with something of that name, it may be actually for the purposes of removing such a prior function rather than introducing a new one.
And just as a final point, of course, this doesn't. None of this takes away from the fact that the EU withdrawal bill is really not what it says on the tin, but the right questions still don't seem to be being asked, Alex.
No, the right questions are, was it ever intended on the continent or in our own controlling circles in the city and Westminster for us to have an option to leave? So we've been through 2 rounds of naming for this bill. The first name was the Great Repeal Bill, in which we see nothing's being repealed. Now it's called the EU Withdrawal Bill. It may actually have its name changed once we realise as a nation that we're not withdrawing from the EU.
Absolutely. Well, look, we mentioned the 2-year extension, and this letter has been published today. This is from the Secretary of State for exiting the EU, David Davis, and also from Philip Hammond, and also from Business Secretary Greg Clark. Greg Clark, the 3 of them have said in this joint letter that they are committed to providing business with certainty and clarity that businesses need to plan ahead. That UK firms will continue to trade under unchanged EU rules during the post-Brexit transition period. The duration of that period is going to be strictly time limited, however, and is going to last about 2 years. They say in order that our terms of trade remain unchanged during the implementation period, it will need to be based on the existing structure of EU rules and regulations. Our intention is to mimic the breadth of our current arrangements from goods to agriculture to financial services, meaning that every business, small or large, will be able to go on trading with the EU as it does today until it's time to make any changes necessary for the future partnership. So that's all a bit vague, not really clear, but we are going to have a transition period. It's going to be strictly time limited. Whether there's any scope in that to extend that for a further 2 years, well, that remains to be seen.
It's all dangerous stuff, Mike, and what did I notice down at the bottom left hand? It's the Right Honourable Greg Clark MP, Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. This sounds so Soviet to me.
Yeah.
I see a Soviet style model. Well, you could say it's Soviet in some ways, but it's fascistic in other ways. But this is nothing to do with exiting the European Union. This is about creating a new state system.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Is this Alex?
It is indeed, yeah.
So, Alex, police probe Portugal's financial minister over Benfica tickets.
This is a bit complicated. You can see him there with Eurogroup behind him. The Eurogroup is the group of countries who are members of states of the European Union and which use the euro as their currency. So it is basically one of the finance ministers of a Eurozone country is appointed to speak on behalf of all of them and effectively to act as the finance minister of the Eurozone. The initial holder of this title was none other than Jean-Claude Juncker himself when he was Luxembourg finance minister and prime minister. If I'm not wrong, he combined the 2 titles because Luxembourg is a banana republic where that's kind of possible. And then it was Jeroen Dijsselbloem after Juncker was in post for 8 years. And Dijsselbloem was the Dutch finance minister celebrated for his prickliness. And from 2013 to 18, he was the chap. And now there's a bit of an experiment because for the first time, a finance minister from one of the pigs, that's Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Greece, Spain, the countries that had to be bailed out by the stability mechanism, which is the other side of the coin for the Eurogroup, the European Stability Mechanism. One of the bailout recipient countries, Portugal, has now provided its finance minister, whose full name is Mario José Gomes de Freitas Centeno. So he's a bit of an aristocrat. And Mr. Centeno was previously finance minister, well, he is still finance minister of his own country, was previously advisor to the socialist contender for the Portuguese presidency, Mr. Costa. What's happened is no sooner has he been appointed Mr. Dijsselbloem's replacement and only the 3rd ever incumbent of the role of chairman of the Eurogroup, very important and strict and sensitive role at this time. So that's 2 weeks ago. Well, what happens? The Portuguese police raid the office of the Portuguese finance ministry in Lisbon. And the allegation is that Mr. Centeno, who is known to be a lifelong supporter of the Benfica, Portuguese Premier Football Club, seems to have arranged advantages for a real estate company owned by, if I'm not wrong, the manager or in some way connected with that football club, so that they got fiscal advantages, tax breaks unfairly, is the allegation which they're being raided for, and that the finance ministry agreed that. Mr. Centeno denies any involvement, even though he is known to be a lifelong fan of the club in question, Benfica. And in fact, when Benfica played FC Porto recently, Mr. Centeno prevailed upon the club to give him access to the skybox, which is supposed to be for the president. I think that means for the president of the club and or the national president. And he said afterwards he hadn't unduly used his influence because he was requiring it for security purposes, because you couldn't expect a finance minister to stand with the plebs. So we don't have a very suitable man here, and this is the first time that we've tried this experiment in the Eurozone of seeing whether the Mediterraneans really do have the same mentality and code of conduct as the Germanic nations, which is the whole point of why the Eurozone is falling apart, because this was said in advance that it wouldn't work. The laxity, the fiscal standards, the business cycles are all completely disparate and divergent. And this, I'm afraid, is the practical experiment of this. The proof of the pudding is in the eating. You give the Eurozone tenure to a country whose interests are in sucking the blood out rather than pumping the blood in, and this is what happens.
And what are the Dutch police up to then?
This is the police for the worst neighbourhood in The Hague, a neighbourhood where I had my case stolen out of a train once on the way to the airport. And the police for this neighbourhood, best known as the Schilderswijk, if people have been on the train through The Hague, it's the area around Holland's Spoor railway station, the big menacing Victorian railway station full of criminals. If you've been through that area, you'll know the Schilderswijk is this very dodgy area around there, and the beat policemen for this police district of central Hague have made a rapping and hip-hop video to be down with the kids. You can see even the older officers in their 50s there in the back seats are waving their hands like hip-hoppers. And the bearded wonder at the front there is saying, and I can get away with saying it by doing it by using the Dutch form of the word. He says, "You must not fokken with our beat area." Because there's a double entendre in there, of course. He may be pretending to say we're a really, a tough area, don't mess with us, as in the people. But the message, of course, to the young people is don't F with us, i.e. the police. Even by Dutch standards, I'm pretty gobsmacked that such a video has been set out. And Dutch public reaction has been largely to say, are these guys so desperate to be wanted to want to be thought likable?
Yeah, I was able to see a few seconds of that video, just outrageous. And again, my question would be who initiated the policy in the Dutch police for this standard of behaviour? Utterly appalling.
Right. Robert Hannigan, former head of GCHQ, is in Hong Kong. So let's see what he's there for.
I'll be talking about security in particular and how we do this great transformation in the digital era in a way that is safe for people and respects ethics and privacy. The internet and the World Wide Web were not created with security in mind. And we're about to amplify that insecurity by adding billions of new little devices through the Internet of Things. Unless we find a way of building security into that next generation, the whole thing is going to be insecure.
So this is at the Great Festival of Innovation taking place in Hong Kong, not in the not too distant future, a couple of weeks. Well, the world has changed apparently, and the world of work has changed, Brian. Technology has created new industries, business models and behaviours. And to kickstart the Great Festival of Innovation, they're going to explore how work is being transformed by innovation, radical ideas and disruptive technology. And audiences will discover how savvy businesses are evolving and working together to adapt to these changes and how they're prospering. They're going to discuss the importance of free trade, sustainable energy, cybersecurity, fintech, artificial intelligence, future workspaces, and much more. So just about every policy agenda that Theresa May has been talking about for the last number of months and reiterating again at Davos last week is going to be discussed at that. This is the British way forward, apparently. I don't see anything terribly productive in there. In fact, what I see there is stuff which is going to remove people's jobs, never mind create new jobs.
He's mentioned that famous word transformation. People have really got to pick up on this word, because transformation is used without ever saying what you are transforming from to. And so the 2 bit is the bit you need to know about, because our analysis shows that the new society that's being created is not one we're going to enjoy. And he drifts in there the Internet of Things. If people haven't heard that expression before, the agenda is that every single item that you have, you use, you come across will have its own unique identity chip, and therefore that item will be databased and tracked. Everything, every single thing in the world will be chipped. That is the agenda.
There's also a parallel agenda, increasingly the Internet of People. Now, whether we're going to be chipped, that's another question. But anyway, look, he was talking about security and cybersecurity and so on. I have to say I found this one particularly strange, and I'm interested to get your view and also Alex's on this. It seems like a silly story to start off with, but this is Strava, the fitness tracker, and the BBC here saying that the online fitness tracker Strava has published a heat map showing the paths that users log as they run or cycle. So this is about people that are running around with this device, and it's tracking them as they go. It's tracking how far they run. It's tracking the paths that they take, and then they have published this map showing, of course, everybody's tracks, so you get a heat map. But what was being highlighted here in the BBC and right across the mainstream media today was the fact that this included military personnel, and they were focusing on US military, and the fact that the jogging habits of US military personnel on foreign bases were being published by a private company, and potentially showing targets to insurgents.
Well, potentially giving the geographic layout of the base, because many people will jog around the perimeter, Mike. So you're absolutely getting the size of the base identified there.
So, Brian, the first thing that struck me about this was to ask the question: is the US and perhaps the British military, are they so incompetent that they are not considering the security issues of people using these devices? Is it not likely that military personnel have been given a blanket ban on the use of these types of devices?
Well, I'm going to say it's complex. What can we say? Well, of course, the military does know about these things because there's a policy over the use of mobile phones which can be tracked. And obviously, for example, if you have a ship at sea and somebody's going to have their phone with a location feature activated, then potentially the ship is then going to be tracked. So yes, there are policies, but I think we've got a bit of a conundrum coming in here, Mike, that who really frames these policies? Well, we come back to the National Cyber Security Organisation that we mentioned on Friday. So all of this stuff is coming through. We don't want to tell people too much about it, because the ordinary person, whether they are a serviceman or woman or a member of the general public, will begin to see how they can be tracked. So I think what's happening in the military is that the briefing is not coming down from a higher level, and the reason it's not coming down is because the more military people are briefed about how they can easily be tracked, the more the public. Maybe I'm wrong. That is just my best estimate.
Alex?
Well, I came at this through a more specifically American military and GeoInt company, or website rather, that reported on this. The title is "How a Popular Running App Reveals the Discrete Routines of Life on Base" by Kelsey Atherton on C4ISR.net. And it reveals that troops at Incirlik Air Base, the very sensitive US air base in southern Turkey, like to jog around the nuclear weapons storage sites. That's one of the things that this application, Strava, has been able to throw up. And the deliberation here is saying, well, actually, it's one of a series of apps such as Snapchat, which aggregate data which people are allowed to make private. They have the option of going to the back screens of the app in question and saying, keep this part private, don't include me in the survey. But mostly people forget to do that, or are not bothered, or don't know how, or don't see the reason why they have to. And even if they do mark their data as private, it does get aggregated at the server. So the company and whoever it's passed to for commercial or security reasons does still know where the aggregation of certain activities at certain times is happening. And at the end of the article, the suggestion is that the problem is human error, and this is something that's plagued every endeavor from the dawn of time. Well, that's a typical sign-off line for a tech article, of course, suggesting that people are still people. Well, yes, but we have now leveraged our abilities so much that our ability to get one over on each other and to aggregate huge amounts of unclassified data into something very sensitive is totally unprecedented in this age. And as with the whole of the internet, Mike, things could have been set by default to privacy, and they were in the early days. If you follow people like the American intelligence media disclosures, they keep saying that the original geeks who designed the internet specifically wanted privacy to be the default in everything, and that when the code was basically stolen by some cabals, it was deliberately set to default to openness, at least openness to the controllers of the system.
Well, I mean, the main reason for that, I think, Alex, is commercial. But yeah, I take your point. I think I come back to again. I think I'm staggered that military personnel are being permitted to use these things at all.
Well, we'll see what happens now is the main thing. It's hit wider public media. Now let's wait and see what happens. Well, let's come on to the subject of child abuse. Nothing to worry about, Mike, because Ofsted has produced its report on Rotherham, and here's the headline: Rotherham Children's Services are transformed. So there we are. That's the problem all solved. The quality and impact of services for children are transformed. Children at risk of sexual exploitation were identified and received an effective multi-agency response to protect them. I'm going to say focus on the word transformation, because in my opinion, this is what this whole thing is about. It's nothing to do with protecting the children. Let's pop back for a moment and see what was really going on. Well, children being abused, and when this was about to blow, here's the action of the council staff. They seized files and wiped computers to cover up the scale of the child sex grooming. So this is the reality of it. Children were being abused, and then officials took information and destroyed it to hide the crime. So we're talking criminal activity. People threatened. UKIP MEP sent death threats after slamming Rotherham Council over child abuse scandal. We've got this one here, a researcher who tried to expose the Rotherham abuse feared for her life after police officers' threat. So the reality of Rotherham is not only that children were abused, but officials, many of whom should have been protecting the children, were prepared to commit further criminal acts in order to cover up the crime. But not to worry, because everything's been solved now. Ofsted has praised action taken by Children's Services Department to improve its child protection work since being rated inadequate. So criminal activity was then labelled inadequate, and now we've solved the inadequateness of the organisation, the inadequacy of the organisation, by transforming it. And how do we do this? Well, we bring in a government-appointed commissioner, Patricia Bradwell. So you can have a look at her. She's worked in other local government offices, where I was Children's Services for Lincolnshire County Council. And what was she going to do? Well, now we get a clue. The council to have strong and supportive partnerships which are underpinned by a common vision, ensuring clarity on roles and responsibilities, both individually and collectively.
That would be a common purpose.
Yeah, this is all about partnerships and collective leadership. The second paragraph, there's clearly been a step change in partnership working through better leadership. So we forget the children, we're now into changing the management structure into this collaborative, collective partnership working. So this is politicisation of the whole thing. This is the report itself, which you can find on the internet. So I encourage people to go and have a look and read it for themselves. This is some of the sort of thing it says. I'll just jump into this bit. Risks posed to children and young people by domestic abuse and high-risk adults are considered effectively in Multi-Agency Risk Assessment Conference, MARAC, and Multi-Agency Public Protection Arrangements, MAPA. The local authority responds immediately to domestic abuse concerns through effective early screening in the MASH. So nobody who was originally involved in failing in their job to protect the children. Nobody was abusing the children, has been brought to book. But what we've now done is brought in this highly interlinked management structure, which is bringing all the agencies together with no separation of powers.
It was interesting that this morning on the Today programme, Brian, one of the people that was involved in this review was being asked questions. It was a pre-recorded interview on the Today programme, and as usual, the presenter said, and I began by asking, and she said, I began by asking, are any of the staff that were at Rotherham at the time still there? And his answer was no, 75% of them are still there, right? So she said, are any of the staff still there? He said no. So that wasn't the question she asked.
No.
And so what she was trying to get into people's minds was the idea that there'd been some kind of purge of staff, but this has never happened.
Correct, Mike. And we've picked up on this, and we were invited to do some action. For people who want to freeze the frame, they can read that clearly now. But let's move on to the next bit here. The majority of assessments seen by inspectors, both in early help, where children are in need of help and protection, were of good quality. The majority. So when you read through this report, you will see that there are still problems, but that gets pushed into the background because everything's okay because we've changed the management structure. In this text on screen, it says this: assessments for a small number of children assessments for a small number of children are not considering the impact of cumulative risks, particularly in respect of domestic abuse. Children's voices are not always explicit. I don't know what that means. I think I might know what it means, but I'm not too sure. Alex, linguistics is your expertise. What are these people saying here?
This technique is known as disguising the subject. So there is deliberately no mention here of the, I should say, in more correctly grammatical terms, it's the topic that's missing here. The subject of the sentence grammatically is children's voices, but the topic, which is who's actually concerned, who's doing here, is deliberately not mentioned. Children's voices. Well, of course, voices don't do anything on their own. They're spoken, they're heard, they're directed, etc. I take this to be standard weaselese for we have the right to speak for the children. We, the blob, will tell you what the children says. More approximately, it could also be a way of, in a veiled sense, wrapping the existing blob over the knuckles for having never bothered to let children say, I do not want to be in this institution or with these people, or I feel uncomfortable. That's the more charitable way of understanding it, as an old-fashioned headmasterly way of saying you could do better at letting the children say what's going on. But I understand it more sinisterly than this, particularly because, as one of our chat box people has said, if you look at the governance statements of these blobs, the one in Plymouth says the phrase common purpose in it. Don't know about the Rotherham one, but I wouldn't be surprised. But it's a blob here really saying we have the right to speak for the children in the famous internet meme phrase, won't somebody please think of the children, which has gained notoriety among young people because it's a clever way, a technique that they've noticed people use in the real world. I demand the right to speak for the children. If you speak against me, you must be a monster.
Alex, thank you for that. We will do more on this, but of course the children are supposed to have a voice in child protection matters, what the children want, what they believe, which parent they regard as dangerous, which is loving. The view of the child we are supposed to believe is paramount. I think, as you do here, that actually the children's opinion is simply now being shut out. We think for you, no matter what the age. And just perhaps to reassure our viewers, we've picked up on this. We spoke to Ofsted this morning. We've sent them this email. I won't give it to you all. You can freeze the screen and have a look at it. But we said we've read the public media articles concerning the latest glowing Ofsted report, which states that Rotherham Children's Services have been transformed. I'm also told that no counsellor or officer holding responsibility during the period of serious failings and harm to children has resigned or been replaced. Can you tell me if this is true? We also believe there's been no formal investigation into those individuals. Can you tell us whether this is correct? We also understand that even as this latest Ofsted report has been released, that Rotherham Children's Social Services are withholding information concerning child protection cases so as to cover up ongoing failings. Can you comment on that? And we also believe that Rotherham Children's Services are refusing to fully engage with members of the public expressing concern at ongoing failings. Will you comment on that? And then we're pointing out that we know for a fact that within Sheffield at the moment are cases where refugee mothers have tried to protect their children from abusers. The child has then been taken away from the mother, and the mother has been vilified, child given back to the abusive father. All going on in Sheffield social services within communities where the primary language is not even English. These people can't understand what's being said to them in court. This is despicable. Clearly, Mike, in Sheffield, they're targeting very vulnerable migrant families for their children. So we'll be interested to see what Ofsted has to say.
We're out of time. Brian, do you mind if we just pop through to the last one? We'll cover this tomorrow. But I just wanted to end the programme today by letting everybody know, if you don't know already, that long-time journalist Robert Parry, who has been running Consortium News for so long, we reported back in December that he had suffered a stroke. Unfortunately, he passed away on Saturday following 2 or 3 more strokes. He had undiagnosed pancreatic cancer that he had been living with apparently for the last 4 or 5 years. Do go and have a look at the report about Robert Parry on Consortium News. Of course, he's best known for exposing the Iran-Contra affair. And then when Gary Webb published his expose in Dark Alliance in the mid-1990s, the allegation was that the Reagan administration had allowed the Contras to smuggle cocaine into the US to make money for their efforts. Robert Parry supported Webb, while Webb was getting the most obscene attack from the mainstream media over his stories. So a long-time journalist, a long-time upholder of the truth, and a sad loss to the media community. Any closing thoughts, Alex?
It's very sad to see that he's not with us anymore. Mr. Parry has really been one of the figureheads and driving forces behind the new alternative media scene that we have. When I was a child, obviously there was no internet. Well, there was secretly, but the alternative and free media was garishly produced flyers and magazines and so on, and talks at halls. That was about as far as you could get it. And it was thanks to Robert Parry and many others of his ilk that he was, I think, quite peerless in his quality and dedication, who had the guts and who went out on a limb when there were small operations and braved being sued, who've made this possible. And of course, they braved being sued because they knew jolly well that Iran-Contra and the drugs and so-called freedom train, to take his prominent story, was entirely true and provable. And that if you don't get sued as an operation, it shows that you've done your research and that you know that exposure would be even worse for the powers that shouldn't be. So rest in peace, and I think that he will be pleased to see what's become of his work in the coming generation, because there's no going back from here.
Oh, absolutely.
Excellent. Alex, thank you very much for joining us. As always, that's it for today's UK Column News. We will be back at the same time tomorrow. If you're not a subscriber of UK Column, please consider taking out a subscription. We need your financial support. Thank you to all the people who've been donating over the last few weeks. It is much appreciated. We still need those donations to continue to do what we do. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.